دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء قسما بالله رب العالمين ما ارتضينا غير دين الله دين فهو دين الحق دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء
هذا الدر وهذه الكلم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to Finding Me on the ITV networks. Today we're focusing on a very important discussion that affects many Muslims and particularly the Muslim woman. The discussion is on domestic violence, and with me I have Fatima Mukaddam. She's just completed her master's on the politics of privacy, focusing on the domestic violence in particular communities here in South Africa, in Johannesburg, and she's going to share some of the insights that she gained from this particular research. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much, Fatima, for being here.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for having me.
Wa alaikum salam. And I think the nice part about continuing this process is you're also now a fellow at S03, the Oval Social Research Institute.
Yes.
So it's about opening up and having more discussions, I think, in terms of the South African context, learning about South African important things about South African law and the way in which South African politics works.
Definitely.
And I think you can put all that together in terms of the Muslim community as well, isn't it?
Definitely. So I started this project in 2014.
Okay.
And it was handed in 2016. The motivation for me wanting to do this research was actually a book written by Shafinaz Hassam, Sophia. So I attended the launch, and in that book she talks about domestic violence and how a woman suffers. And I know of a few instances of domestic violence. However, it's always swept under the rug. Mm-hmm. And having done my honors amongst Muslims, I wanted to do my masters amongst Muslims as well. And I felt that this was a pertinent issue then, as well as today in 2017. And it needs to be addressed as well as spoken about in our community. So
as a Muslim academic, you feel it's important for Muslim academics and Muslim students and Muslim researchers to actually turn to their own communities and talk about issues within their own communities rather than leave other people to talk on our behalf, isn't
100%.
Yes.
We have problems. It's not like we are a perfect community. So we need to solve our own problems. It really frustrates me when I read articles about domestic violence taking place in Muslim homes and it's written by a white Western scholar. And I feel she doesn't really have a right to speak on our behalf. And so I feel as Muslims, we should take the narrative back and be speaking about our issues.
As you were talking, I just had a discussion with a friend yesterday, actually it was. We were talking about experts, and I said, Kostas Douzinas said that with the arrival of the experts, it's brought the death of the academic, because then suddenly you have all of these people who claim to be experts, but there isn't that true intellectual discussion or that alternate discussion. It's within the decolonial framework also speaking of the voices from within, because now you have the experts who are commenting on everybody else. And I think perhaps the greatest problem we have in terms of Islam is all of these experts speaking on behalf of Islam and Muslims.
Yes.
And I'm sure you found that in your research as well.
Definitely. People speaking on behalf of Muslims, saying we need to go to these countries and liberate these Muslims. And I'm like, are these Muslim women asking for them to be liberated?
Exactly, no. And that was the same narrative in Afghanistan. With
exactly.
With liberating the Afghani woman, we bring them democracy. And the same story with Malala Yousafzai as well. We have to give education to the Muslim woman. They're oppressed, etc.
100%. And I mean, it's been happening over centuries. So it's not a particular issue that's just unique to the Muslim community. If you look at feminism in general, we started with the first wave feminist movement where white women were fighting for their rights, and then they decided to speak on behalf of black women. And that gave rise to the second, third, and post-feminist movement, because people want to speak for themselves. And I believe they deserve the space to speak for themselves and on behalf of themselves. We have no right to be voicing, even my research. Although it's my community, I also have a role to play. So I can't speak on behalf of these women.
Yes. You simply try your best to bring forth their voices.
100%.
Yes.
100%. And sidelines my voice.
Yeah, and I guess what people don't understand is there's no such thing as an objective or neutral or bias-free research. Everybody brings their own particular opinions or viewpoints.
100%.
And the way in which you write it definitely slants that
of course.
Writing in that particular direction.
If you're a non-feminist, you could take my research and completely twist it.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And while you're talking about these different feminist movements, I recently read also a beautiful article by, I can't remember her name, but she's an Indian activist. And she also said that if you really look at the feminist movement, although the white feminists started the movement, even that they prioritized the white rights over that of a black woman.
100%.
So you know, when Fanon speaks of the zone of being and zone of non-being, that the black woman in the space of the white woman is in the space of non-being.
100%.
And so, do you see this evolution in terms of Muslim women as well?
I think so. I think as it's a very slow progression, but I think there are more and more Muslim women speaking about pertinent issues that affect us and our lives. And I think we, to an extent, we are taking our narrative back and trying to speak on our behalf and just also trying to shed Islam in a good light with so much of negative press on Islam. We're trying to show that.
Well, I think also in a way the negative press in Islam is because of the way in which it's manipulated by the so-called experts who speak.
100%.
But again, as you said right at the start, we have our own problems and we make our own mistakes and we do create our own confusions and destructions. And so it's answerable and we have to correct these by speaking about it and talking about it. When you spoke about claiming the narrative back, I think what's very important, which I looked at in your work, is that there are a lot of Muslim voices who have guided you, Shahana Rasool, Dr. Shirin Ali, you said Shafinaz Hassam, and there was another female that you mentioned also.
Shireen Hassam.
Shireen
and then
Hassam,
obviously my supervisor, who was not a Muslim, but she's played a pivotal role in my over these 2 years. She's just amazing.
Yeah, what shows that there are plenty of people who are willing to allow for these different dialogues to come
Of course,
through.
definitely.
So your title is interesting, or the part of one of the things that you mentioned is the politics of privacy. What is that, and why did you go for that?
Okay, so the politics of privacy is when we think of domestic violence or when we think of talking about it, people say, oh my God, it's a private matter.
Okay.
Leave it to the family. And for me, that's problematic. The notion of this public-private divide is a problem. So, for example, we have the public, so what's allowed outside, and then we have the private, what takes place behind closed doors in the home. However, there's been an article written by Tessa Hochfield and Rasool Basadin. I think her name is Shahana as well. I'm so sorry about that. I can't remember her name. But she writes, it is Shahana Rasool Basadin, sorry. So they write about how the politics of, around privacy and public don't work the same in South Africa. And because a majority of our population lives in poverty, sometimes this notion of the door and the private does not exist at all.
Right.
So often shacks are built right next to each other. You have more than one family living in a household. Therefore, there are people who are aware. Or houses are built so closely next to each other that you can hear things happen on the outside. So whilst the public and private divide may work very well in a Western context, in a South African context, it doesn't fit well at all.
Or maybe perhaps in a more upper class.
Exactly.
Context, yeah.
However, my critique of that idea is that, yes, it doesn't work in a low-income household. However, in your upper class and middle class households, it does work. Big walls, high fences, electric fences, they exist.
Yeah, the gated communities.
Yes, gated communities. So sometimes we don't know, but sometimes we do know what's going on. And I think we need to... The problem with the private is that when it comes to state intervention, people aren't so, or the state isn't so willing to get involved or assist where they can. So if you have a woman who goes to the police station, sometimes she'll be turned away. Or the process itself of going to court, getting a restraining order, this whole process is so long and so messy that sometimes women just become despondent.
Yeah, I suppose it's daunting, and they feel like, like, do I really need to go through? I'm already humiliated, and this is perhaps more humiliating.
Exactly.
So it's psychologically, it's a double phase for them. I think.
Definitely.
So they go through it. So in your focus now, you looked at particular cohort of Muslims in a particular area. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Okay, so initially my project was to take place in a mosque. I wanted to go to a mosque.
Very ambitious.
I know, right?
In the South African context.
I was so hopeful. I had so much of hope. So I tried to go to a mosque. The Greenside Mosque was very open to...
About the only one, yeah.
Yeah, they were very open and willing to allow me in, so thank you. However, it didn't work because of the sensitive nature. The Mulana didn't know how to integrate me and my research into the mosque.
Okay.
And I don't have years to wait.
Yes.
If I did, I would have waited. But I needed to get this done. So when the mosque was a failure, I decided to go via a snowball effect. So getting referrals. So I first interviewed the Jamiat and Islamic Care Line and NISA, and then Zubaida Dango from NISA. And then they gave me some people, and then I called those people up. Would you be willing? Yes or no? And then from there on, I found my respondents. However, because it's referrals, majority of my group was middle-class Muslims, Indians. There was one revert, and so she wasn't an Indian, but she was the most staunch, to be quite honest, in terms of Islam and, for instance, enforcing Surah Nisa. So yeah, that was my constituency.
And you worked with this woman and talking to them, getting their stories, getting their perspectives?
Yes. So I held 4 focus groups. One was with men aged 19 to 35, men aged 35 plus, women aged 19 to 35, and women aged 35 plus. And I felt like I wanted to do that because sometimes the intergenerational approach shows how far we as a community have come and what work still needs to be done.
So we're going to go to a break shortly, and I just want to get this particular question in. I'm curious because you had a cohort of men. Well, are the men also the abused, or you focused on them as abusers?
I focused on them as abusers, and not because I don't believe men don't suffer from domestic violence. We know they do. However, the percentages and the stats speak for themselves.
It's overwhelming.
Women are the majority of the cases, and therefore, and being a woman myself, I'm obviously going to focus on my own gender.
Yeah, and so how was the response? Because I mean, you put the men in a very critical spotlight. So are these men who were abusers, or men who just spoke on behalf of men in terms of abuse?
They were different. So the men aged 35 plus group was very interesting. Shame, they're so cute. All these uncles sitting there. I didn't get the sense that they were abusers at all. However, they understood how Surah Nisa could be implemented.
Okay, so you use them for that particular aspect. Okay, so we have to go to a break now, but when we come back, then we're going to turn to Surah Nisa, and I would like you to then explain the different discussions that you discovered and unpacked in terms of this very, very important verse in the Quran, and I think it needs further elaboration, but we'll see you after the break.
بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار ظلم وحلا في مولده النغم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار ظلم وحلا في مولده النغم.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to the second segment of Finding Me today in the ITV networks with my guest Fatima Mukaddam, and we're talking about domestic violence in the middle class Muslim families of Johannesburg. So before we went into the break, you were explaining that this particular cohort, or these groups that you had, and the men and the women, and your focus on Surah Nisa. Okay, now Surah Nisa verse 4, so it's Surah 4 verse 34, is a very important verse, and I think it has brought a lot of misunderstandings, misrepresentations, but I find also that from my own particular research, a lot of the people who wrote on it, again, was speaking on behalf of Muslim women, speaking on behalf of the Quran, speaking on behalf of Islam, without actually being aware of or familiar with the particular text or with Islam in general. And I find that very problematic, especially if you consider this verse literally and without the broader holistic understanding of what the principal grounding in Islam is, and that is justice. So what did you find when you started to unpack Surah Nisa verse 34?
First of all, we need to understand and know that the interpretation of the Quran is very important, because generally, most of the times, it tells us more about the interpreter than the actual verse. So the context he or she is interpreting from, what year, and so on, and what type of political climate it is at that point in time.
Exactly.
And we have many Muslim scholars, Leila Ahmed, Amina Wadud, and so on, who claim that, and argue, and rightfully so, that the Quran has a history of being interpreted by men.
Yes.
And therefore, they will bring a patriarchal understanding to the interpretation. So I used one particular interpretation in my research. It was N.J. Dawood, and I used it for 2 reasons. One, because I read a book by Aisha Chaudhry who used this particular interpretation, And secondly, and most importantly, it gave room for the most discussion. So if you'd like, I can read the interpretation out. It says, Men are qawamun, authority over women, because God has preferred some over others, and because they spend of their wealth. Righteous women are obedient and guard, in their husband's absence, what God would have them guard. Concerning from those women whom you fear nushuz, disobedience or rebellion, admonish them and or abandon them in bed and or wadirhubina, hit them. If they obey you, do not seek means against them. God is most high and great. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack with this particular interpretation. First of all, we have concerning from those women whom you fear disobedience. First you admonish them, then you don't sleep in the same room, and lastly you're allowed to hit them. The problem if you read this verse in isolation is it gives a particular set of repercussions that happen to women. However, the verse doesn't go on to clarify what does a disobedient woman mean. What does she need to do in order to say, oh, you've disobeyed me, one smack? How hard is this? How hard should this hit them be? And so that's why I use this interpretation, because it gave so much room to just critique it. And out of all of my respondents, Naeem Jinnah was, when he first heard this interpretation, he shook his head and told me, that's a terrible interpretation. You really need to do more work. and I sat there thinking to myself, I let him go on. And he unpacked this verse for me, which is very long, but he went on to argue that, like I said, initially it tells you more about the interpreter, but the beginning of the verse and the beginning of the surah talks about just men and women in general, and how then can all of a sudden, right at the end of the verse, we're talking about husband and wives, which is something I hadn't thought about before my interview with him, and he's so right. And then when I took this verse to my respondents, I mean, the Jamiyat, they're never going to critique an interpretation. So the representative from the Jamiyat, who asked not to be mentioned, his name not to be mentioned, agreed with the interpretation. Didn't critique it, didn't say anything about it, just kept quiet and said, that's the interpretation. And that was it.
This is the one that you quoted to him?
Yes.
Okay.
Right? But we know there's a million other interpretations. In my thesis alone, I used 5 different interpretations to show the differences and how, in the years that it was written, and how it evolved, how the interpretation had evolved to an extent. The men in the age 35 plus group said something to the effect of, we don't contest what's in the Quran. If it's there in the Quran, it's fine. It's God's word. So I'm like, but is it okay to hit your wife? No. I mean, only if she's disobedient. What does disobedient mean? No, like if she fails to do Islamic stuff, like not wear hijab, not wear scarf. Okay. So anything else? They couldn't think of anything else. The women in the 35 plus group were, I mean, they accepted the verse for what it was, but obviously didn't advocate for being hit. However, 2 women in the group said that if you don't read your namaz, if you don't wear a scarf, if your husband tells you to leave the house with a scarf on and you don't listen to him, that's disobedience. And he can reprimand you for it. And it was very interesting for me because I had this revert on the panel and she was like all for this verse and all for being reprimanded. And I told you that I cannot, I mean, I suppose I can fathom it because I understand her background. However, I don't understand why she would be so staunch about enforcing this verse.
You know, I have a problem with the interpretation that you've used because I definitely don't believe the Arab is to hit. If you look at the actual context of what comes before and what goes after. But not only that, I mean, the simplest thing, you started off by saying that this public-private, and you said, you know, don't talk about what's in the private because that's for, you know, don't talk about it, it's a private matter. Yet Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam said, khairukum khairukum li ahli. The best of you are the best to your family, which means that which is happening in the home is, you know, what they say don't talk about. But he clearly advocated for the best behavior in the private
100%.
Before you can manifest it into the public. Not only that, I mean, on many occasions he said, do not hit. you know,
Of course.
the woman and respect her and all of those things. But not only that, the sequence for that particular explanation to me just does not make sense. So if you're admonishing her, you're separating from her, why then do you hit her?
Yeah.
The next best, if you're separating from her in the bed, then obviously the third next step is separate from her altogether, not hit her, because you can see this is not going anywhere. And if it's not going anywhere, you're going to hit her. How much do you expect it to come
work.
together?
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's not only that, it's dehumanizing and degrading, and Islam is certainly not about that.
Of course.
Because like I said, if you look at this verse simply in terms of the criteria of justice, the founding principle of Islam, there's no way darb can be interpreted, in my opinion, as hit. So when you unpacked this, did you find the same kind of discussions as well?
Yes. So with my younger generation, in the men 19 to 35 group, they were, and the women, both groups were like, no. You need to look at the Prophet. The Prophet treated his wives the best.
Yes.
And therefore, if he, the greatest human on this earth, never hit his wife, what gives us the right to do so? And those sentiments did carry on to the older generation, but not as explicitly. There was one young guy in my group, and because he comes from a BA background, he was like, no. If the interpretation itself is focusing on inequality or the fact that women are less than, it's a problem, and we need to challenge this, because we know how many rights Islam awards to women and the status of women in Islam. But he was the only one, and he was the youngest.
Yeah, but you see, then again, it shows that the education level makes a huge difference. And you're speaking about the other older woman, and they agreed with it. I think that is firstly because of a lack of education, but not in terms of, I'm not being patronizing, but I think the kind of education that they have received, the colonial education, firstly, which indoctrinates women into believing that they're subjective to men, because colonialism brought patriarchy. Most of the society, if you look at in Africa, and if you look at the Muslim communities, have always been matriarchal societies. Yeah. And patriarchy and all of those negative qualities that came with colonialism, which pushed forward the subjugation of women. I mean, women in Western countries were never afforded the kind of rights that Islam had already given to women 1400.
My men in the 35 plus group said the exact same thing, completely critical of the Western world, and it's amazing how they always took things back to how the West has just changed the view of Islam and made us look bad.
But they've adopted the same kind of mentality, because unfortunately we have become colonized.
No, definitely.
There's no doubt in my mind that South African Muslims are colonized and suffer from a colonized mentality. And this colonized mentality then, I think, is perhaps in many ways also manifested in the religious organizations that claim to speak on behalf of us.
No, definitely. So, and I also think because we're Indians, we know we come from India, right? There was no Pakistan before that. So my dad, for example, after the partition, they moved to Pakistan. But we come from a patriarchal country. And therefore, a lot of these ideas and cultural thoughts come with us. And even though we're living in South Africa in 2016 with this great constitution that awards us equality, and we know our religion, we have managed to confuse and merge culture and religion together.
Yes.
And it's so confusing for some people that when we ask them to break it away, they can't.
Okay, so we're almost at the end.
Okay.
What would you like to tell women who are experiencing these kinds of issues, or maybe are in domestic violence or in situations of domestic violence? What?
My advice would be to get help. You don't have to be subjected to the abuse, and just do yourselves a favor. Everybody in this country needs to do themselves a favor and read the Domestic Violence Act and understand that domestic violence doesn't mean physical abuse, but it's psychological, emotional, monetary abuse as well. If anyone needs help, they can contact NISA. They are based in Lens. You can even call them on 011-854-5804 or 5. You can contact POWER as well, which stands for People Opposing Women's Abuse, on 011-642-4345.
No, that's wonderful. And what is your concluding remark, or what would you like to end with in terms of Muslim women, domestic violence, and how we should respond to it?
I feel like we need to talk more about it. It's happening, it's taking place, not just in Muslim communities, in all communities. We need to remove the stigma and taboo from certain issues such as domestic violence.
Especially for the woman speaking about it.
Of course, definitely. And women need to feel that they're safe and have a safe space to go out and talk about it and seek help. Obviously, there needs to be state and civil society intervention. And by this, I mean that there aren't enough NGOs dealing with this issue or have a safe haven for women to run to. I believe the implementation of the Domestic Violence Act in South Africa is pathetic, in my opinion. And so there just needs to be so many bodies that come together and try and address this issue, because it can't be just up to me who's doing research.
Besides Nisa, we need just more young women, especially educated young women, to come together, lawyers, psychologists, sociologists, nurses perhaps, women from different groups, different professional backgrounds to come together and say, you know what, we're going to start something, we're going to do something. So hopefully this will be a message
Inshallah.
For the younger generation.
I hope so.
As a project, rather than more sub kitchens or more just general activities, let's do something to empower women and to start speaking on behalf of ourselves.
Definitely.
Okay, thank you very much, Fatima, for being here and for sharing this. Fi amanillah, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
قسما بالله رب العالمين ما ارتضينا غير دين الله دين فهو دين الحق دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء.
هذا الدر وهذه الكلم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار.